Hi, my name is Amanda Brown, and if there's one thing that my friends and family all know about me, it's that I love bread. Bread has been a staple in my diet for as long as I can remember, and sourdough bread has always had a special place in my heart. It's tangy, airy, simple, and easier on my stomach than most breads. For the rest of the world and throughout history, bread has been a staple for most other people too. And while sourdough today isn't a main part of people's diets, it was for a long part of history. Sourdough bread has a long history around the world, but it likely originated around 2000 BC in Egypt. The Egyptians learned that by leaving out a mix of flour and water to sit and ferment, they could create soft, light breads with high acidity. They, along with Northern Europe around the same time, had discovered the leavening of bread. Sourdough, though it wasn't called by that name until much later, remained relatively unchanged throughout the Middle Ages. Bread making remained a domestic activity, especially in rural areas, though bakers did begin to emerge in the cities. We can track the shift away from sourdough to just before and at the very beginning of the Industrial Revolution in Europe. In the 1600s, the French rediscovered brewer's yeast in bread making. There were initially concerns about the health effects of this yeast, but ultimately brewer's yeast was used in combination with sourdough techniques going forward. In the 1800s, an Austrian baker discovered a technique to make bread without any sourdough at all. This was a welcome alternative, as the shelf life of these loaves was longer than that of sourdough bread, and bakers were able to free themselves from the demanding schedule of keeping several sourdough starters alive and active. With Industrial Revolution technologies, like the steel rollers used to refine flour, bread became much easier to make on a large scale, and buying bread outside the home became more and more common for both urban and rural communities. The final blows to sourdough bread making came from two key sources: changing ideas surrounding health and nutrition, and World War I. Throughout the Industrial Revolution, a movement against sourdough because of health concerns began to emerge in the United States. Concerns about the sour flavor of the bread made people worried that fermented bread could have a negative effect on the human body, basing much of this on anecdotal evidence. These arguments tied in with concerns about efficiency and consistent quality of sourdough bread. This became a particular problem during the First World War, when ingredients were scarce and women were expected to make food last. This excerpt from a World War I cookbook, Homemade War Breads, shows how women had to find new ways to make bread during the war. It offers tons of options for substitutes in bread, with no mention of sourdough. Conditions in the war created new priorities for everyone, and homemade sourdough bread was no longer plausible. With all this learning about sourdough, it only made sense for me to try and grow a sourdough starter myself. My family has had a starter for years, so I thought, how hard could it be? Making my starter was a lot harder than I anticipated. Here it was on day 1, and it took me 11 days to get to a fully ready starter. I fed it 2 times a day and had to experiment a lot with how much flour and water to add, where to leave my starter, and how long to go between feedings. And it has finally doubled in size. You can see this is where it was after the feeding last night, and this is where it is this morning, so that's very exciting. When my starter was finally ready and it passed the float test, I couldn't wait to get baking. Unfortunately, my first loaf didn't go so well. The flavor was good, but it was super dense. I've been trying more recipes and getting better, but it's definitely a process. Sourdough is a lot of trial and error, and baking with it is different for every starter. It's understandable that these would create issues for efficient bread making in an industrial world. Despite these concerns, sourdough is definitely having a resurgence. Beginning in the 80s and 90s, people began to search for authentic, artisanal bread and quality that they just couldn't get from industrial bread products. San Francisco bakeries even began to sell pre-made or dried starters for people to use at home. Additionally, sourdough has been recently described as being more nutritious and easier to digest for people with gluten sensitivities or allergies. It's interesting that the very factors that marginalize sourdough in bread making, industrialization, and health concerns, have brought sourdough back in full force. The COVID-19 pandemic contributed to this fascinating surge of eager sourdough makers. With the shortages of yeast at the beginning of the pandemic and a huge amount of free time, the pandemic created an opportunity for people to experiment with sourdough. Considering how time-consuming the process can be, sourdough making was a great option for people stuck at home looking for new ways to connect with their families and with themselves. My dad's cooking has always been an important part of my life, and he has led me to love homemade sourdough as well. In my family, Friday nights are our weekly homemade sourdough pizza nights. I thought I'd ask him a little bit about how we make our pizza and try it out for myself.
The night before we make it, we set the starter out, feed it, and then let it rest overnight. And then middle of the afternoon, we get the sourdough starter out, put it in a big bowl on a scale with starter, flour, yeast, and water. Mix that up, knead it for 7 to 8 minutes, put it back in a bowl with kind of saran wrap covered, put it in a warm place for 3 to 4 hours, and pizza dough is ready.
In these past couple months, learning about the history of sourdough, growing my sourdough starter, and baking sourdough pizza and bread have made me feel just a little bit closer to home. While I understand why sourdough isn't the ideal industrial bread and why it fell out of popularity for a while, it's been great to see people recently connecting with the art of sourdough bread making. It definitely takes patience, but it is so worth it.